School is back in session, and it sparked memories of my own educational journey. I came from a family of educators. My grandpa is a retired music teacher. My grandma was a substitute teacher, and my great grandmother worked in the California school district. I guess you can say I come from a family that values education. I remember my grandma telling me anything can be taken from you except knowledge and your education. I've experienced great teachers and teachers who are concerning, but since school is starting back up for students from kindergarten to college, I wanted to talk about the messy history of old disciplinary practices and share modern cases of teachers who chose the wrong profession. This is not an episode for everyone, and I'll be sharing some events involving child abuse or neglect. If that's too much, I get it. Listen to one of the other many episodes of Historically Messy that aren't as intense, of course. But if you're here, I assume you want the uncomfortable truths and history. Some of the oldest documented methods of disciplinary techniques were practiced by Roman professors who regularly tormented their pupils. The word pupil is Latin-based and derives from the word pupillus. Auribulus Pupillus was alive during the 1st century BC. He was from Benventum in ancient Rome and was the Latin professor of the famed poet Horace. Horace's epistles, Book 2, Epistle 1, line 70, Auribulus is referred to as plagosus. This translates into the flogger, the thrasher, or the whacker. Auribulus wrote a book titled On in Reasoning, and it consisted of his complaints about insults schoolmasters like him received from arrogant parents, his own bitter sentiments about his fellow professors and colleagues, and disdain that he felt for his students. Almost 200 years later, Roman rhetorician Quintilian wrote Training of an Orator. This piece focused on positive behavioral encouragement instead of physical punishment. Even in ancient Rome, students had different learning styles that didn't respond to physical abuse. Shocker. Roman schoolmasters set the standard for Western ideals of organized education. And when I think of a tyrannical teacher, I think of the Victorian era professor who ruled their classroom with a firm cane and a stern tone. Victorian classrooms consisted of up to 300 students, which is really overwhelming when you think about it. All of them had one teacher, and that teacher had 8 to 10 teenage pupils who managed small sets of children. The older students acted as aides to ensure the younger children in their group were moving along with the teacher's curriculum. These classes were the size of college lecture halls, except the students were much younger. Teachers ran their classrooms with strict discipline. For example, Ruth Goodman is a historian. She did a piece with the BBC titled Inside Victorian Schools about Victorian-era discipline and techniques. That was the part that I really wanted to focus on. And here's a short clip from that video, which you definitely should watch.
But there are a couple of things about this model of having one adult teacher and a bunch of teenage helpers. How on earth can you control a space this big with that many kids in it? Well, there is only one way, isn't there? And that is absolute discipline. These places were ruled with a rod of iron, and they had to be. How else could you cope? Total silence, total obedience. Discipline was extreme and harsh, and the punishments were frequently very physical.
Yeah, so that was terrifying, right? Yeah. This means for the last 2,000 years of Europe's recorded history, physical, mental, and emotional abuse was a regular technique used to control students. So, can we expect anything different in the United States, a country with governance and foundations modeled after Rome and Great Britain? Probably not. So now, Let's talk about the current allegations of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse against today's educators. There was a recent case in Glasgow, England, that triggered my own memories of neglect at the hands of a teacher. Patricia Robertson is a retired residential school teacher from the 1960s up until the 1980s. And in October of 2025, she was found guilty of 18 out of the 25 counts of child abuse. One of the charges was the cruel and unnatural treatment of young girls. Survivors of her abuse described being force-fed, assaulted, and humiliated by Robertson. I personally can understand the helplessness and victimizing feeling of having someone else control your food. I experienced a teacher withhold my lunch from me as a form of punishment. I feel that experience attributed to my complicated relationship with food today. And to have one's autonomy violated is very distressing as a child. Also, it's important to note that children don't have or sometimes possess the vernacular to verbalize what is actually going on. And even if they are able to tell an adult, their chances of this adult actually believing them is also kind of slim. So it almost is advantageous for people with these types of characteristics or behavioral tendencies to flock to certain professions. And I think we'll see that when we look into why people probably inflict abuse or neglect onto children or helpless groups and demographics within our society. Robertson also dictated what students were able to write in letters to their parents and targeted one young child by slapping, punching, and throwing things at her. For example, like the little sponge that you use to wipe off a chalkboard. Robertson was found guilty, but avoided jail time due to her age. I believe she was around 77, which is very ironic when you think about it because the survivors who were victimized as children made them very vulnerable. So Robertson, she was sentenced to 3 years of supervision in order to pay each survivor £1,000. I'm sure you can imagine many of the survivors were discouraged about her light sentencing. Now, we know Patricia is not unique, and multiple cases of abuse at the hands of an educator go unchecked. A study from the NIH titled The Hidden Threat in Schools: Understanding and Managing Toxic Teacher Behaviors. This study explored what toxic behaviors in teachers could point to in a destructive learning environment and how best to address these concerns. The study was conducted around 2022 and 2023 in Turkey, and it focused on teachers from the perspective of educational leadership, aka your principal. The study noted extensive research has been done to examine the toxic behaviors of principals and other high-level administrators, but little had been done to evaluate the toxic behavior of teachers. So the toxic behavior consisted of the usual dark triad of personality traits. This triad consisted of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. The characteristics associated with the dark triad were low performance, professional inadequacy, and a lack of social skills. So the reason for this study was to understand the characteristics of toxic educators, their impact on schools and colleagues, and explore how principals can cope with these toxic behaviors. So these study results found that they indicated that the characteristics of toxic teachers encompassed a wide range of behaviors associated with various personality structures and psychological traits. Behaviors such as manipulation, self-interest, destructive criticism, selfishness, and attempts to dominate. They were all identified by school principals as toxic, and they align with the narcissistic and Machiavellian personality traits noted in the literature. Furthermore, toxic teachers exhibited aggression, hostile behaviors, psychological harassment, and threatening actions, which are associated with psychopathy, one of the dark triad traits. The findings of the study revealed that toxic teacher behavior had a wide range of effects that could damage institutional activities and individual relationships. According to school principals, toxic teachers typically hinder collaboration and the creation of a positive working environment. They damage the image, organizational climate, and culture, and the trust of the organization. These results may be explanatory for previous studies, which found that toxic behaviors increase job stress and decrease job satisfaction, organizational trust, and commitment. This probably could explain why teachers are leaving the education system altogether and why some parents prefer homeschool or charter schools, especially after COVID-19. The third set of findings in the study focused on methods school principals to deal with toxic teacher behaviors. The results revealed that school principals gradually adopted two main strategies: constructive methods and discipline-based methods. Constructive methods include positive approaches such as transparent management, involving teachers in decision-making processes, and open communication. When these methods prove ineffective, although, school principals resort to discipline-based approaches such as warnings and disciplinary investigations. These strategies vary according to the context and situation, reflecting the individual approaches of principals. There's a fun saying used to describe a common institutional practice in religious, medical, and educational organizations where toxic members are transferred to another location without new employer disclosure, rather than face termination for serious consequences for their actions. This practice is called pass the trash, which is named appropriately, and could be done to avoid public scrutiny or protect the reputation of the organization. You can imagine how dangerous this practice can be, and I can think of numerous examples where perverted men of God, incompetent doctors, and tyrannical teachers are spared consequences and transferred to another city to restart their victimization process all over again. Teaching is complex and takes more than just the student and teacher to be successful, but it's obvious having a toxic teacher can have lasting effects on a young person. Hopefully, you didn't have a negative experience with your teachers growing up, but if you did, you forgave them and your younger self and realized you were likely dealing with an undiagnosed adult. I found sharing my experience to be healing and realized toxic educators feel deeply inadequate about themselves and find a temporary cure in tormenting children and their colleagues. You might be judge and jury in the classroom or as school principal, but that doesn't make it justified for you to violate others. We appreciate all the teachers who've made us feel seen and inspired us to be curious. They are the real heroes, juggling students, teachers, their colleagues, and parents, and also institutional bureaucracy. Thank you to everyone who has listened, watched, and subscribed to Historically Messy. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you know it's my mission to provide free historical content that focuses on societal concepts affecting us today. We're all interconnected to one another and the past, so why not understand how we can do better? That's all I have for this week's episode. Stay messy, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.